Picture a man shaking, not from cold, from something closer to the feeling you get when a door opens that has been locked for your entire life and for the lives of everyone who came before you. The year is 1822. Jean-François Champollion is 31 years old, and he has just done something no living person has done in more than 1400 years. He has read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, not guessed at them, not approximated them. Read them, the way you are reading these words right now, with full comprehension of what each symbol means and how they connect into language. He walked into his brother's office, said the words, "I've got it," and collapsed. When he recovered, the first thing he wanted was Egypt itself, to stand in front of the actual stone, the actual walls, the actual temples, and read them with his own eyes. He got there years later, and what he found on those walls was staggering. The Egyptians had recorded everything: military campaigns, harvests, religious rituals, the names of gods and the names of kings, stretching back more than 3,000 years in an unbroken chain. He stood in the great temple complex at Karnak and read the names of pharaohs the modern world had not spoken aloud since the fall of Rome: Thutmose, Amenhotep, Seti, Ramesses, name after name after name, carved so deep into the stone that 20 centuries of desert wind had not touched them. The Egyptians were obsessed with names in a way that is difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. A name was not just how you identified a person, it was a piece of their soul. The ancient Egyptians believed that as long as your name was spoken, you continued to exist in some form beyond death. Carving your name into stone was not vanity. It was a technology of immortality. The deeper you carved, the more temples you built, the more monuments you raised with your name on them, the harder it became for death to fully claim you. Champollion understood this as he moved through Karnak, reading names that had waited centuries for someone to say them again. And then there is the other story. There is a story, one of the most told stories in the history of human civilization, that features an Egyptian pharaoh so prominently he might as well be the second main character. This pharaoh orders the murder of newborn boys. He holds an entire people in forced labor for generations. He stands across from a man named Moses and watches his country dismantled by 10 consecutive catastrophes, each one worse than the last. He loses his firstborn son in a single night. He pursues a fleeing people to the edge of the sea. The story is the book of Exodus, and that pharaoh does not have a name. Scholars have been arguing about his identity for more than 200 years. Archaeologists have spent careers digging through desert sand, looking for evidence that might settle the question. Every generation that asks gets the same answer, which is that the evidence points in several directions, and no single direction with enough force to end the debate. But here is what almost nobody talks about. The question of who he was is fascinating. The question of why the text never names him is something else entirely. Because the Bible is not a careless book. The same Exodus that withholds this pharaoh's name is meticulous about other names. It names people who appear for a single scene and never come back. Something is happening in that silence. Champollion could read every name on the wall at Karnak. The one name the whole world has been asking about for centuries was never there to read. The mystery is not only that history cannot find him, it may be that the story which made him famous was never built around his name at all. Start with what the text actually says. Most people think they know Exodus. They have seen the movies, heard the sermons, read the children's versions. But there is a difference between knowing the story and reading the text. And that difference matters here more than almost anywhere else in the Bible. Open Exodus to the first chapter. Read it slowly. A new king arises over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That is how it begins. Not with a name, not with a year, not with a description of the man himself. With a relationship he does not have. Joseph had saved Egypt from famine, had elevated his family to positions of prosperity, had built a bond between the Hebrew people and the Egyptian state. This new king has none of that history. He looks at a large and growing population of foreigners living in his territory and sees not a legacy, but a threat. So he enslaves them. He puts slave drivers over them. He assigns forced labor. He builds cities. And the text names two of those cities, Pithom and Ramesses. That second name, Ramesses, has sent generations of readers in a very particular direction. We will get there. But first, stay in chapter 1, because what happens next is one of the most remarkable passages in the entire Bible, and almost nobody slows down for it. The king decides that enslaving the Hebrew people is not enough. They are still multiplying. So he calls in two women and gives them an order. Their names are Shiphrah and Puah. They are midwives. They work at the lowest level of social visibility, present at births, serving women in the most vulnerable moments of physical life. They have no armies. They have no political standing. They are not related to Moses or Aaron or any figure the narrative will later elevate. They appear in 4 verses and then they are gone. But they are named. The king who summoned them, the ruler of the most powerful civilization on earth at that moment, is called Pharaoh. He is not named. He is not described. He does not have a biography the text finds worth recording. He has a title and a function. Shiphrah and Puah do not carry out his order. When he calls them back to answer for this, they tell him that Hebrew women are more vigorous than Egyptian women, that they give birth before the midwife even arrives. The text does not say whether this is true or a carefully constructed lie. What matters to the narrative is that 2 women, with nothing but nerve and a shared decision, stood in front of the most powerful man in the known world and did not do what he told them to do. The text says God dealt well with the midwives, and then it names them again. Now read that with attention to what the text is doing. Exodus is not a book that withholds names out of laziness or oversight. The same book names Moses, Aaron, Miriam, Jethro, Zipporah, Hur. It names figures who appear for a chapter, sometimes for a single verse. The text is generous with names. It hands them out to people on the margins of the story. And the man at the center, the one who commands an empire, the one whose decisions set everything in motion, is Pharaoh. This pattern does not announce itself loudly. It does not stop and explain what it is doing. It simply does it, and trusts that a careful reader will feel the weight of it. In other words, Pharaoh in Exodus is not only a man in a story. He is a kind of power the story wants us to recognize. And the effect of leaving him unnamed is that he cannot be contained by a single historical moment. He cannot be filed away as one specific ruler from one specific century. He stays open. He stays present. He stays capable of being recognized in forms the original storytellers could never have anticipated. But before getting to what that means, we need to deal with the historical question directly, because the historical question is real, and it has produced 200 years of serious scholarship that cannot be dismissed. The text gives us clues: the cities named in chapter 1, the geographic setting, the cultural details embedded in the narrative, and scholars have spent generations trying to match those clues to a specific pharaoh, a specific dynasty, a specific moment in the documented history of ancient Egypt. What they found is a debate that has never closed, and the reason it has never closed turns out to be just as interesting as any answer it might have produced. The clue that started everything is that city name, Ramesses. In the eastern Nile Delta, sometime in the 13th century before the Common Era, a pharaoh with an unmistakable name built a brand new capital city and named it Pi-Ramesses. He put his name on more structures across the landscape of Egypt than almost any ruler in the country's 3,000-year history. He fought major battles, signed major treaties, and reigned for 66 years, long enough that an entire generation of Egyptians grew up knowing no other pharaoh. His name was Ramesses the Second, and the moment you say that name out loud, the debate begins. On the western bank of the Nile, about 170 miles south of modern Luxor, there is a place called Abu Simbel. If you approach it from the river at dawn, the way travelers have approached it for 3,000 years, the first thing you see are 4 seated figures carved directly into the face of a sandstone cliff. Each one sits about 65 feet tall. Their hands rest on their thighs. Their faces look east, toward the rising sun, in the particular expression that Egyptian royal sculpture reserved for eternity. Not quite smiling, not quite stern, simply present in a way that suggests they have been sitting there since before you arrived and will be sitting there long after you are gone. Each of the 4 figures is the same person. His name is carved above the entrance, on the sides of the thrones, across the facade. It appears on temples from the Nile Delta to the edge of modern Sudan. Few rulers in Egyptian history placed their name across the landscape with such obsessive scale. He ruled for 66 years, long enough that, when he finally died, probably in his 90s, his people may have briefly wondered whether the world could continue without him. He is the reason the conversation about the Exodus pharaoh almost always starts in the same place, and almost always ends there too. Ramesses the Second is the most famous candidate. He has been the most famous candidate for about 200 years. When Cecil B. DeMille made the 10 Commandments in 1956, and Yul Brynner put on the double crown of Egypt and stared down Charlton Heston across the throne room, the image he projected was Ramesses the Second. When most Americans picture the Pharaoh of the Exodus, they picture someone with that scale, that ego, that particular combination of magnificent achievement and spectacular stubbornness. The image is so thoroughly embedded in popular culture that it has become almost impossible to think about the Exodus without it. There are real reasons for this association, and they go beyond movies. The most immediate one is that city. Exodus chapter 1, verse 11 says the Israelite slaves were forced to build storage cities for Pharaoh, and one of those cities is called Ramesses. In the 13th century before the Common Era, Ramesses the Second built a grand new capital in the eastern Nile Delta and named it Pi-Ramesses, which means, roughly, the House of Ramesses. Archaeologists working at the site of Tel el-Daba and surrounding areas have found evidence of large-scale construction from this period, with remains suggesting the labor of a substantial workforce in that region. The geographic overlap is hard to ignore. The area where Pi-Ramesses was built is the same general region that Exodus associates with the land of Goshen, where the Israelite population is described as living. If you are reading Exodus and looking for a pharaoh who built great cities in the eastern delta during a period when a large Semitic population was present in that area, Ramesses the Second is sitting right there, checking multiple boxes at once. His reign also fits what scholars call the late date for the Exodus, which places the event somewhere in the mid to late 13th century, before the Common Era. Many scholars who accept a historical core behind the Exodus narrative have favored some version of this timeline, and Ramesses II is the figure most naturally associated with it. And then there is the sheer scale of the man himself. Ramesses II understood, at a level few rulers in history have matched, that power is partly a performance. He did not just win battles. He commissioned enormous reliefs of himself winning battles, carved onto temple walls, where they would be visible to everyone who passed through. He did not just sign a peace treaty with the Hittites. He made sure that treaty, one of the earliest surviving peace treaties in recorded history, was inscribed in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform and distributed across his empire. He fathered somewhere between 45 and well over 100 children, depending on which sources you trust, and he made sure posterity knew about them. This is a man who would have understood the Exodus narrative as a direct challenge to everything he believed about himself. A pharaoh who saw himself as the living embodiment of divine order, who had spent 66 years projecting the image of invincible power, being told by a former member of his own household to release his labor force in the name of a god he did not recognize. The confrontation has a psychological coherence when you frame it that way. Of course he would refuse. Of course he would keep refusing, even as the disasters mounted. His entire identity was built on the premise that he could not lose. But here is the problem. In 66 years of reign, Ramesses II generated an enormous volume of documentation. His military campaigns are recorded in detail. His building projects are catalogued. His religious dedications are preserved. The textual record of his reign is one of the richest of any ruler in ancient history. None of it mentions anything that looks like the Exodus. No record of a large Semitic population departing Egypt. No account of 10 catastrophes devastating the country. No mention of the death of the firstborn. No reference to Moses by any name. No record of a military disaster at a body of water in the eastern delta. Now, there is a standard answer to this, and it carries real weight. Egyptian royal records were not neutral historical documents. They were instruments of power, designed to project the image of a pharaoh who was victorious, blessed, and cosmically aligned with divine order. Recording a national catastrophe caused by the demands of a group of foreign slaves would have been antithetical to everything those records existed to do. We will examine that argument carefully in a later chapter, because it matters more than people usually give it credit for. But there is a second problem with Ramesses, and this one comes not from archaeology, but from inside the Bible itself. 1 Kings chapter 6. Verse 1. It says that Solomon began building the temple in Jerusalem in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of Egypt. Historians place Solomon's temple construction at around 966 before the Common Era. Add 480 years to that, and you arrive at approximately 1446 before the Common Era. 1446. That is roughly 2 centuries before Ramesses the Second was born. If that number in 1 Kings is meant as a literal historical figure, the entire case for Ramesses collapses before it begins. The most famous candidate for the Exodus Pharaoh cannot be the Exodus Pharaoh if the Exodus happened 200 years before his birth. That single verse has been driving a separate argument for 300 years. An argument that puts an entirely different set of faces on the throne. And then there is a third problem. A granite slab discovered in 1895 that nobody saw coming. And that changed the terms of the entire debate in a single afternoon. Ramesses the Second gives the mystery a face. But a face is not the same as a verdict. And the stone that complicates everything does not have his name on it at all. In the winter of 1895, a British archaeologist named Flinders Petrie was clearing debris from a mortuary temple in the ruins of ancient Thebes. Petrie was not a romantic figure in the way popular culture imagines archaeologists. He was methodical, exacting, and frequently difficult to work with. He was also one of the most skilled excavators of his generation, with a gift for reading the layers of a site the way a careful reader reads a text, paying attention to what was underneath what, and what that sequence meant. His team found a large granite slab, about 10 feet tall, covered in hieroglyphic text. The slab had originally been made for a different pharaoh, Amenhotep the Third, and Merneptah, the son of Ramesses the Second, had simply repurposed it for his own victory inscription. Recycling monuments was standard practice. Quarrying and carving new stone was expensive. Petrie had the inscription translated. Near the end of the text, in a passage listing the peoples and regions that Merneptah claimed to have defeated during a military campaign in the region of Canaan, there was a name, Israel. The line read, "Israel is laid waste. Its seed is no more." Petrie reportedly looked at the translation and said, with characteristic British understatement, that the theologians would have quite a time with this. He was right, but not entirely in the way he expected. The Merneptah Stele, as it came to be called, contains the earliest known reference to Israel outside the Bible. It was written somewhere around 1208 before the Common Era, during the reign of Merneptah, the son of Ramesses the Second. And when scholars understood what they were holding, the Exodus debate shifted in ways that nobody had fully anticipated. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were serious scholars who questioned whether the Israelite people, as described in the Bible, had any historical basis at all. The Merneptah stele made that position very difficult to maintain. A group of people identifiable as Israel existed in the region of Canaan at the end of the 13th century, before the Common Era. An Egyptian pharaoh considered them significant enough to mention in a victory inscription. Whatever else you believe about the Exodus story, these people were real and they were there. But the stele does not say anything about an exodus. It does not say Israel recently arrived from Egypt. It does not refer to any catastrophe that affected the Egyptian state. It simply lists Israel among the peoples of the region that Merneptah's army encountered during a campaign. And here is where a grammatical detail that most popular accounts skip over turns out to matter. In Egyptian hieroglyphics, when scribes wrote the names of cities or established nation-states, they used a specific symbol called a determinative that marked the word as a settled place. When they wrote the name of a people without a fixed territory, they used a different determinative, one that indicated a group of people rather than a place with borders and a capital. Israel on the Merneptah stele has the determinative for a people, not a place. From the Egyptian perspective, in 1208 before the Common Era, Israel was not being described as a settled state like the other powers of the region. They were a people group, present in Canaan, but not yet defined by fixed territory the way kingdoms and city-states were defined. This does not prove a recent exodus, but it does suggest that Israel in this period was still in the process of becoming what it would eventually become as a settled nation. Now follow the implications for the timeline. If Israel was present in Canaan and not yet fully settled there by 1208 before the Common Era, then whatever event the Exodus narrative describes had to have occurred before that date. How long before is the question that keeps the debate alive. This puts pressure on the late date theory in an interesting way. If the Exodus happened under Ramesses the Second, who died around 1213 before the Common Era, then the Israelites had only a few years at most between leaving Egypt and appearing in a Canaanite campaign led by his son. That is a very compressed timeline for a 40-year wilderness period. Some scholars looked at this compression and drew a different conclusion. What if Merneptah, not his father, was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? What if the steel's boast that Israel's seed is no more was not a record of a Canaanite military campaign, but Egyptian propaganda about a labor force that had just walked away? Under this reading, Merneptah expelled the Israelites, then chased them into Sinai, then later encountered them again in Canaan and claimed a military victory over them to save face. This interpretation has not found wide acceptance. The chronological problems it creates are severe, but it shows how the stele, rather than resolving the question of which Pharaoh was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, simply moved the argument to a different set of problems. There is something else the stele does, something that tends to get lost in the debate about timelines and candidates. Flinders Petrie found a piece of Egyptian granite with the name Israel on it. He found it in the ruins of a temple built by the son of the most famous candidate for the Exodus Pharaoh, the son of the man who may have watched Moses walk away from the palace, or who may have been the man himself. Later stood in Canaan, looking at these same people, and boasted that he had destroyed them. The boast was wrong. The people he claimed to have destroyed are still here. The inscription that claimed to end them is sitting in the Cairo Museum, and people travel from around the world to look at it. Meanwhile, the Pharaoh who made the boast has a name on the stele, and a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and a mummy in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo that you can pay to see on a Tuesday afternoon. And neither he nor his father appears by name in the story that made both of them famous. The stele gives us Israel in stone. It does not give us the Pharaoh of the Exodus. What it gives us instead is a deadline, a fixed point in the historical record before which the Exodus, if it had a historical core, had to have occurred. Everything before 1208, before the Common Era, is still open, and that open space is where the real argument lives. There is a verse in the Bible that most people have never paid attention to, and it has been quietly splitting scholars into two camps for about 300 years. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. Solomon began building the temple in Jerusalem in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of Egypt. One sentence, tucked into a chapter about architectural measurements and construction specifications, is easy to read past, easy to forget entirely. But stop and do the arithmetic, because that single verse pulls the entire Exodus debate in a direction that makes Ramesses the Second impossible. Historians place the beginning of Solomon's temple construction at around 966 before the Common Era. That date comes from cross-referencing biblical chronology with Assyrian records and other ancient sources, and it has enough independent support that most scholars accept it as reasonably reliable. Take 966 and add 480 years, and you arrive at approximately 1446 before the Common Era. 1446. That is roughly 2 centuries before Ramesses the Second was born. If the number in 1 Kings is a literal historical figure, then the Exodus happened in a completely different century than the one most people picture when they picture the Exodus. The famous candidate is not just uncertain, he is impossible. And the Pharaoh the world has been looking for is not the man with 4 65-foot statues at Abu Simbel. He is someone else entirely. Welcome to what scholars call the early date. The early date is not a fringe theory passed around on internet forums. It has been defended by serious historians and biblical scholars for generations, particularly among those who believe the internal chronology of the Bible should carry significant weight in historical reconstruction. Its supporters would say the late date became popular not because the evidence demands it, but because it fits more comfortably with a particular reading of the archaeological record, a reading that late-date defenders shaped over decades. That is a strong claim, but the early date has some strong evidence behind it. 1446, before the Common Era, puts the Exodus in the middle of what Egyptologists call the 18th dynasty, one of the most documented periods in ancient Egyptian history. The pharaoh ruling at the moment of the Exodus on this timeline is likely Amenhotep the Second, the pharaoh presiding over the period of oppression described in the early chapters of Exodus, when forced labor intensified and the order to kill newborn boys was issued, would likely be his father, Thutmose the Third. Thutmose the Third is not a minor figure. He is sometimes called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. He conducted 17 military campaigns into the Levant and Canaan over the course of his reign, expanding Egyptian control further north and east than almost any pharaoh before or after him. His reign lasted about 54 years and represented the height of Egyptian imperial power in the region. A pharaoh overseeing a vast, labor-dependent empire, with a growing foreign population in the eastern delta, fits the Exodus narrative reasonably well. Some early date scholars point to a noticeable reduction in military activity during the early years of Amenhotep the Second's reign, and read it as consistent with a weakened empire in the aftermath of the catastrophes described in Exodus. The evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, but it is the kind of detail that gives the early date argument texture rather than making it purely speculative. So, why does the late date still dominate most mainstream discussions? The short answer is the city of Ramesses. Exodus chapter 1, verse 11. names Ramesses as one of the cities the Israelite slaves were forced to build. That city name is very difficult to place in the 15th century before the Common Era. The great royal city of Ramesses, the most natural fit for the biblical Ramesses, was built by Ramesses the Second in the 13th century. Pushing the Exodus back to the 15th century means either that the city name in Exodus is anachronistic, updated by a later scribe to reflect a place name familiar to the audience at the time of writing, or that the identification of biblical Ramesses with Ramesses is simply wrong. Early date defenders accept the first explanation and point out that scribes updating place names to reflect current usage was a common practice in the ancient world. Late date defenders say this explanation is too convenient, that it requires the text to be selectively trusted and selectively corrected depending on what fits the preferred timeline. Both sides have a point, and neither side has fully won the argument. Then there is the problem of Jericho. The book of Joshua describes the Israelite conquest of Canaan as including the dramatic collapse of Jericho's walls. If the early date is correct, and the Exodus happened around 1446 before the Common Era, the Israelites would have entered Canaan around 1406 before the Common Era. Kathleen Kenyon, the British archaeologist who conducted the most thorough excavations at Jericho in the 1950s and 60s, concluded that the site showed no evidence of a significant occupied city during that period. Her findings have been disputed. Bryant Wood argued in the 1990s that Kenyon misread the ceramic evidence, and that a destruction layer at Jericho does in fact fit the early date timeline. The argument between their two readings of the same physical evidence has never been definitively resolved. It sits in the academic literature as an unfinished conversation between two different ways of reading the same dirt. Here is what that back and forth actually reveals. Both the early date and the late date run into walls, not the walls of Jericho specifically, but walls of evidence that neither timeline can fully get past. Every time one side produces a compelling argument, the other side produces a compelling counter. Every time a piece of evidence seems to settle the question, a different piece of evidence unsettles it again. And that pattern, sustained over 200 years of serious scholarship, has pushed a growing number of careful researchers toward a position that sounds unsettling at first, but follows logically from the evidence, or from the persistent absence of it. What if the question of which Pharaoh was the Exodus? Pharaoh does not have a single answer because the Exodus was not a single event. Some scholars propose that what the Bible calls the Exodus is the product of a long process of memory formation, in which multiple historical experiences were gradually shaped into one foundational narrative. Groups of Semitic people moving in and out of Egypt across different centuries, periods of forced labor in the Delta region, divine interventions interpreted through the framework of a covenant theology that developed over generations. These experiences, spread across time, were eventually drawn together into a unified account that carried the full theological and communal weight the Israelite people needed it to carry. This does not make the story false. It means the story may be doing something that a single historical chronicle cannot do. It is preserving not just what happened, but what it meant. Not just events, but the interpretation of events that allowed a people to understand themselves as a people. Under this reading, asking which specific Pharaoh was the Exodus, Pharaoh is like asking which specific storm inspired every sea story ever written. The question assumes a precision that the nature of the material may not support. Change the date, and the pharaoh changes. That much is clear. But the mystery does not disappear when you change the date. It just moves to a different century and sits there, asking the same question in a different language. And here is the question that both clocks, the biblical clock and the archaeological clock, keep returning to without being able to answer. If neither timeline can be confirmed, and if the identity of the pharaoh remains genuinely open after 200 years of serious investigation, then what exactly is the historical investigation trying to recover? A name, a face to put on the man across from Moses. The text of Exodus has been perfectly clear about how it feels about that project from the very first chapter. It does not give the man a name, and the reason for that turns out to be more carefully considered than anyone looking for a specific pharaoh has been willing to admit. There is a temple wall at Karnak that tells one of the most revealing stories in the history of official memory. The wall records the Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 before the Common Era between the Egyptian army of Ramesses the Second and the Hittite army of King Muwatalli the Second. The Egyptian version, carved in hieroglyphic relief that you can still read today, describes it as a stunning triumph. Ramesses, surrounded by enemies, calls on the god Amun, summons something beyond ordinary human strength, and turns the tide of battle through sheer personal heroism. His enemies are routed. His glory is confirmed. The gods have spoken through him. There is another version of the same battle. It comes from the Hittite records, preserved in the archives at Hattusa in modern Turkey. The Hittite version does not describe a crushing Egyptian victory. It describes a stalemate. Both sides took heavy losses. Neither side achieved its strategic objective. The battle ended in a negotiated peace treaty because neither power could decisively beat the other. Both versions are true in the sense that both sides genuinely experienced the battle, but only one of them made it onto an Egyptian temple wall. This is the most important thing to understand about why Egyptian records do not mention the Exodus. The Egyptians were not careless record keepers. They recorded enormous quantities of information with impressive precision. The issue is that Egyptian royal inscriptions were not designed to preserve accurate history in the modern sense. They were designed to project the image of a pharaoh who was powerful, victorious, and cosmically aligned with the divine order that kept the universe functioning. A pharaoh who acknowledged that his army had been undone, his economy disrupted, his labor force had walked away, and his gods had proven less powerful than the god of a group of foreign slaves, was not projecting that image. He was destroying it. And in a society where the pharaoh's invincibility was not just political propaganda, but a cosmological necessity, recording the Exodus would have been something close to an act of civilizational self-destruction. This does not prove the Exodus happened. It explains why the absence of Egyptian records cannot be treated as evidence that it did not. Those are two completely different arguments, and keeping them separate matters. The first argument says the absence of Egyptian records is suspicious and suggests the Exodus is not historical. This argument fails because it misunderstands how Egyptian records worked. The second argument says the absence of Egyptian records is understandable given how those records worked, and therefore the silence is not evidence in either direction. This is the correct position. The silence requires explanation, and the explanation that royal Egyptian inscriptions systematically excluded humiliating defeats is a good one, but a good explanation for why evidence is missing is not the same as evidence that the underlying event occurred. With that distinction held clearly in mind, there is one Egyptian text that gets pulled into the Exodus debate regularly, and it deserves careful attention. The Epilogue papyrus is an ancient Egyptian document that describes a period of catastrophic social breakdown. It takes the form of a lament in which a figure named Epilogue addresses a great lord and describes a world turned upside down. The river runs with blood. Grain is gone. The land is without light. People who were servants have become masters. The children of princes are dashed against walls. Fire has gone up on high. Some readers, beginning in the 19th century, have argued that this is an Egyptian account of the 10 plagues. The parallels to specific events described in Exodus are striking enough that they are difficult to dismiss entirely. Blood in the river, darkness, death of children, the collapse of social order. The correspondences feel too specific to be coincidental. But the dating of the Epilogue papyrus has been contested since the day it was found. The physical papyrus itself was copied during the New Kingdom period, but the text it preserves appears to be much older, possibly from the First Intermediate period, which ended around 2050 before the Common Era. That is centuries before any proposed date for the Exodus. Many Egyptologists read the admonitions of Epilogue not as a record of the plagues, but as a literary lament about a period of political instability and drought, of which there were several in Egyptian history. The honest assessment is that Epilogue is intriguing, suggestive, and impossible to pin down with the evidence currently available. What it demonstrates, perhaps most usefully, is that the ancient world had a shared vocabulary of disaster, rivers of blood, darkness, the death of children, the collapse of social order. These images appear in Egyptian literature and in Exodus, not necessarily because both are describing the same historical event, but because catastrophe has a recurring grammar that different cultures reach for independently when they try to describe the experience of a world coming apart. Now there is another silence in this story, and it is not about missing papyri or absent inscriptions. It is a silence inside the Exodus narrative itself, and it raises a question that readers have been arguing about for 2,000 years. 7 times in Exodus, the text says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, not that Pharaoh chose to be stubborn, not that Pharaoh's pride made him refuse. The text says God made his heart firm against releasing the Israelites. There are also passages where the text says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Both strands sit in the narrative without full resolution, and both have been generating theological arguments ever since. Augustine saw the hardening as evidence of divine sovereignty, God exercising an absolute right to use any human will for purposes larger than that individual's own intentions. John Calvin built significant portions of his theology around this passage, arguing that God's hardening of Pharaoh's heart was an expression of the same divine will that shaped all of human history. But there is an older reading, offered by the 3rd century theologian Origen, that connects to something the historical debate has never quite managed to reach. Origen argued that the hardening was not an external imposition on a man who might otherwise have chosen differently. It was the natural consequence of what decades of absolute, unchallengeable power does to a human being. A man who had spent his entire life being told that he was a god, that his will was the highest authority in the universe, that no demand placed on him from outside could be legitimate, That man's heart was not being changed by God into something it was not. It was being revealed as what it had always been. In Oregon's reading, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is not really about Pharaoh, the individual, at all. It is about what unchecked power does to any person who holds it long enough. And if that is true, then the identity of the specific man on the throne matters far less than the condition he represents. A condition that does not require a name to be recognized. And that recognition, it turns out, is exactly what the next chapter is about. In the ancient Egyptian understanding of the soul, a person was not a single unified thing. You were made of parts. Your body was one part. Your shadow was another. Your personality, the animating force that made you recognizably yourself, was a third. And then there was the piece that mattered most for what happened after you died. Your name. The Egyptians called it the Ren. It was not a label or a convenience. It was a component of your existence as fundamental as your heart or your lungs. To speak a person's name was to give them a form of continued life. To read their name carved in stone was to extend their presence into the present moment, across whatever distance of time separated you from them. The pharaohs understood this with a clarity that shaped everything they built. Every temple, every monument, every inscription was partly a machine for keeping the royal name alive in the mouths of the living. This is why the punishment of erasing a name was so devastating in Egyptian culture. When the successors of Hatshepsut sent workers to chisel her image and her name from temple walls decades after her death, they were not revising history. They were attempting to kill her again, more completely than death had managed. When Akhenaten's successors systematically removed his name from monuments across Egypt, the goal was not to make people forget a controversial religious policy. It was to unmake the man himself, to cancel his claim on existence in any realm beyond the physical. To be without a name in ancient Egypt was not obscurity. It was annihilation. Now open Exodus to chapter 1 again and read the first 17 verses as if you have never read them before. A new king rises over Egypt. He sees the Israelite population growing and fears it. He appoints slave drivers. He assigns forced labor. He builds cities. He increases the burden when the labor does not stop the population growth he fears. And then, when none of this is enough, he calls in 2 women. Their names are Shifra and Puah. They work at the lowest level of social visibility, present at births, serving women in the most vulnerable moments of physical existence. They have no armies, no political standing, no connection to any figure the narrative will later elevate. They appear in 4 verses and then they are gone. But they are named. The king who summoned them, the ruler of the most powerful civilization on earth at that moment, is called Pharaoh. Not named, not described, not given a biography the text finds worth preserving. He has a title and a function. And the function is to represent the kind of power that issues orders like the one he is about to issue. He tells Shifra and Puah to kill every boy born to Hebrew women. When you are at the birth, he says, if it is a son, kill him. If it is a daughter, lit her, liu. Shifra and Puah do not do it. When Pharaoh calls them back to answer for this, they tell him that Hebrew women give birth too quickly, before the midwife arrives. The text does not say whether this is true or a carefully constructed lie. What matters is that 2 women, with nothing but nerve and a shared decision, stood in front of the most powerful man in the known world and did not do what he told them to do. The text says God dealt well with the midwives, and then it names them again. In a book that contains the parting of a sea, a burning bush that does not consume itself, a pillar of fire in the desert night. The scene that the text honors with the specific gravity of named individuals is this one. Two women in a brief conversation with a king. Two women who said no. Now hold that image alongside what you know about the wren. The Egyptians built their entire civilization around the premise that a name preserved in stone was a form of immortality. The pharaoh's name was sacred, omnipresent, woven into the architecture of eternity itself. To lose your name was to lose your claim on existence beyond death. There was no greater catastrophe in the Egyptian spiritual imagination. Exodus does not send workers with chisels to remove Pharaoh's name from a wall. It simply tells a story in which he never had one to begin with. And the effect of that decision is something that no act of physical erasure could have achieved. Because a name that is chiseled off a wall leaves a mark. You can see the scar in the stone. You know something was there. You can sometimes even reconstruct what was removed. But a name that was never given cannot be recovered, cannot be restored, cannot be whispered back into existence by any archaeologist or any scholar or any amount of careful excavation. The absence is total, and it was total from the first word. Now look at what Exodus is doing with that absence, because it is doing something very precise. Pharaoh in this narrative is not portrayed as uniquely evil in the way a modern villain is uniquely evil. He is not given a moment of private sadism. No scene where he reveals himself to be cruel for cruelty's own sake. What he does is act entirely in accordance with the logic of the system he embodies. He sees a population that might threaten his power, and he moves to contain it. He sees his economic and military interests requiring a labor supply, and he enforces it. When the god of his slaves makes demands of him, he evaluates those demands against the interests of his empire and finds them unacceptable. He is not behaving irrationally by the standards of the world he inhabits. He is behaving exactly as a pharaoh is supposed to behave. He is being the system. And this is where Origen's reading of the hardened heart connects to something the historical debate has never fully reached. If Pharaoh's heart was hardened not by a single divine intervention, but by decades of absolute power forming a person who genuinely cannot choose differently, then what Exodus is describing is not one man's personal moral failure. It is the portrait of what any system produces when it is structured around the belief that one person's will is the final authority over the lives of everyone else. The hardening is not a punishment. It is a diagnosis. And the diagnosis does not require a specific name to be accurate. Give Pharaoh a name, and he becomes Ramesses the Second. A specific person in a specific century with a specific set of circumstances that may or may not match the archaeological record. He becomes a historical puzzle to be solved, a debating point between scholars, a figure whose reality can be questioned on the basis of physical evidence. Leave him unnamed, and the text allows him to be something that cannot be contained by a single historical moment. He becomes every empire that has organized itself around the right to use other human beings as instruments. He becomes every system that responds to the demand for freedom by increasing the burden of those who are demanding it. He becomes every structure of power that looks at the people it controls and sees not persons but a workforce, not souls but a supply. The effect of leaving him unnamed is that he cannot be filed away. He stays present. He stays recognizable. He stays capable of being identified in forms the original storytellers could never have anticipated. This is why the story has traveled so far. When Martin Luther King Jr. stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and reached for the language of liberation, he reached for Exodus. When Nelson Mandela spoke about bondage and freedom, he was speaking inside a story that had already been told. When Jewish communities across centuries of persecution sat down at the Passover table and told the story of leaving Egypt, they were not performing nostalgia. They were identifying the present moment inside a narrative that had been designed to contain it. The Passover Seder does not name the Pharaoh. It never has. The ritual is built around that absence, because naming him would tie the story to one specific moment in history. Not naming him keeps the question alive in every generation. Which oppressor is this? Whose power does this describe? What does it mean to leave this particular Egypt? Those questions are supposed to be asked every year at every table. The unnamed Pharaoh is what makes them possible. Now hold the full weight of that alongside the two women in chapter 1. Shiphrah and Puah are named in a book that withholds the most powerful name in the story. In a civilization where names were the currency of eternity, where the size of your monuments determined the length of your existence beyond death, where kings spent their entire lives ensuring that their names would be spoken forever, these two women, who had no monuments and no army and no political authority, have had their names spoken for 3,000 years. The man who commanded them to kill children does not have a name in the text that has outlasted his civilization, his dynasty, his gods, his monuments, and his empire. That is not an accident of composition. That is not an oversight by a scribe who forgot to include a detail. The effect of the text is unmistakable. Regardless of what we can or cannot know about any individual author's intention, the women who protected life are named. The man who ordered the killing of children is not. And 3,000 years after that decision was made, we are still saying Shiphrah and Puah. We still do not know what to call the king. Go back to the beginning one more time, not to find something new. Go back, because the beginning looks different now, and that difference is worth sitting with before this conversation closes. Champollion stands in front of the wall at Karnak. He has the tools to read every cartouche, every inscription, every royal title on every surface, in every temple in Egypt. He has spent his adult life building those tools, and they work. He can reach across 3,000 years and say the names of people who have been silent since the fall of Rome. He cannot find the one name the whole world has been asking about. Not because it was erased, not because it was damaged by time or lost in a flood or buried under rubble. No excavation has yet reached, because it was never there. And the story that made that absence famous has been living and traveling and finding new readers in every generation ever since. Without the name, across every language and every century and every circumstance in which people have found themselves needing the story that Exodus tells. That is not nothing. That is actually the whole thing. Now look at where the scholarship stands. Honestly, after 200 years of serious effort, the late-date argument places the Exodus somewhere in the mid to late 13th century before the Common Era, most likely during the reign of Ramesses the Second. It has the geographic logic of Pi-Ramesses and the Delta settlements behind it. It has the Meneptah stele, providing a fixed point in the record before which the Exodus must fit, and it cannot produce a single Egyptian document that mentions anything resembling what Exodus describes. The early date argument takes the 480 years in 1 Kings seriously as a historical figure, puts the Exodus around 1446 before the Common Era, and points to a different set of pharaohs in a different century. It has the internal biblical chronology behind it. It has some suggestive archaeological details at various Canaanite sites, and it cannot fully resolve the problem of the city of Ramesses or produce a clean archaeological picture of a conquest-era Canaan that matches the biblical narrative. Neither argument wins. Both arguments have real evidence and real problems. 200 years of serious scholarship has produced not a consensus, but a richer and more honest map of the question. A map that shows clearly where the roads lead and where they stop. And then there is the third position, held by a growing number of careful researchers, that the most honest response to the evidence is to ask whether Exodus is doing something that the tools of historical investigation are not designed to measure, whether the memory it preserves is the kind of memory that gets compressed and shaped over generations of retelling rather than recorded with the precision of a chronicle, whether the search for a single pharaoh in a single year is looking for a kind of specificity that the nature of the material simply does not offer. This does not make the story less true. It asks what kind of truth it is carrying. A photograph and a painting can both show you what a person looks like, but they do so through completely different processes, and you evaluate them by completely different standards. Asking whether a painting is photographically accurate is not a useful question. The painting is doing something photography cannot do, and its truth operates in a register that literal accuracy does not reach. Exodus may be operating in that register. The search for the pharaoh's name will continue. It should continue. The physical evidence of the ancient Near East has not yet said everything it has to say. There may be a papyrus in a sealed jar somewhere under the desert sand. There may be an inscription on a wall not yet excavated. There may be a layer of debris at a site in the eastern delta that will reframe the conversation when it is finally reached and properly analyzed. History is not finished speaking, but here is what 3,000 years of the story's life has already demonstrated. Regardless of what the archaeology eventually finds, the Exodus narrative did not survive because it solved a historical mystery. It survived because it told a truth about human experience that every generation found recognizable in its own circumstances. It survived the destruction of the First Temple and the Babylonian exile. It survived the Roman conquest of Jerusalem. It crossed into Christianity and shaped a theology of liberation that would eventually run through the veins of movements seeking freedom on every continent. It entered Islam and took its place among the foundational narratives of a faith that would come to encompass a quarter of the world's population. A story that travels that far and lasts that long is not traveling on the strength of its historical specificity. It is traveling on the strength of what it knows about the human condition. And what it knows does not depend on the name of the man who sat on the throne of Egypt in whatever century the events it describes actually occurred. The man on the throne can be identified by what he does. He uses people as instruments. He responds to the demand for freedom by increasing the weight of the burden. He watches the world he has built come apart and cannot choose differently, because choosing differently would require him to become someone other than who he has been formed to be. And he loses everything, including his son, while still unable to let go. That is not a biography. That is a pattern. And the pattern has appeared in every century since the story was first told. Wearing different clothes, speaking different languages, sitting on different thrones, always recognizable, always present, always eventually faced by people who decided that what they knew about themselves was more real than the size of the thing standing in front of them. Shifra and Puah recognized it. Moses recognized it. Every generation that has told this story has recognized it. The text left the pharaoh unnamed because a name would have made him one instance of the pattern. The title made him the pattern itself. History is still asking for the name. Exodus already understood why that question would never quite close, and it left the silence there on purpose. Open and permanent and large enough for every generation to find their own version of the answer inside it. Champollion died in 1832. He was 41 years old. He had spent most of his adult life inside a single obsession, and the obsession had consumed him in the way that great obsessions do. In the decade between his decipherment and his death, he read the names of more than 200 pharaohs. He gave the modern world access to 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization that had been sealed since the last person who could read hieroglyphs died sometime in the late Roman period. He built the foundational tools that every Egyptologist after him would use. He never found the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Nobody who came after him found that Pharaoh either. Not conclusively. Not in a way that ended the conversation or satisfied the scholars or stilled the need that keeps driving the search forward. The debate between Ramesses the Second and Thutmose the Third and Amenhotep the Second, and the position that the question itself may be the wrong question. That debate is still being conducted right now in academic journals and archaeological field reports and seminary classrooms and documentary films, with the same energy and the same inconclusiveness that have characterized it since the beginning. But here is what the story itself settled a long time ago. The Exodus narrative was not built around the Pharaoh's name. It was built around what the Pharaoh did, and what the people he was trying to destroy did in response. It was built around two midwives who were given an order they could have followed and chose not to. It was built around a mother who put her son in a basket and placed him in a river because the alternative was watching him die. It was built around a man who stood in front of a burning bush and took off his sandals because the ground he was standing on was holy. It was built around 10 catastrophes and a departure and a sea and a desert and a promise that the people walking toward it could not yet verify with their own eyes. None of that required a royal name. All of it required a people willing to tell the story again. The Passover table is set every spring in homes around the world. The Haggadah is opened. The questions are asked. Why is this night different from all other nights? And the story moves through the plagues, and the sea, and the wilderness, and the promise, and at no point does anyone stop to say the Pharaoh's name. Because the ritual was designed around that absence. The absence is not a problem to be solved before the meal can proceed. The absence is part of the meal. In the ancient Egyptian theology of the soul, a person without a name was a person without a claim on eternity. The Ren was the piece of the soul that persisted across death, that allowed the person to continue existing in some form beyond the end of their physical life. The man who ordered the killing of children does not have a name in the text that has outlasted his civilization, his dynasty, his gods, his monuments, and his empire. Shifra and Pua have been named in that text for 3,000 years. History is still looking for what Champollion could not find at Karnak. Exodus already knew what it was doing when it left the space blank. Not who was he, what was he, and in the answering, the story did what the pharaohs of Egypt spent their entire lives and enormous fortunes trying to prevent anyone from doing to them. It made him disappear, not by force, not by chiseling his name off a wall, by never putting the name there in the first place.